there was a businessman who was on a diet and he wanted to lose weight. And so the only problem is he always had a craving for donuts. Every morning he woke up, that used to be what his normal pattern was, that he would go for donuts. So this morning he drove to the donut shop, and he kept circling around the block, and he made a prayer. He prayed, Lord, I know you don't want me to eat donuts, so, but I just need you to confirm it. There are no parking spaces in this lot and in this donut shop, so I'm going to drive around and see if there are no parking spaces. It'll be a confirmation for me that that's your will for me today. And so he drove around it, and after going 8 times, he found a spot. And he said, oh, Lord, thank you. And he took it. And the rest is history. It's a very funny story. Talks about a simple desire someone had for donuts. And we all can identify with that. And how irresistible it can be at times. But we know what happens when we crave in. It does show up in some area of our lives, isn't it? Because he was just driven by his desire to taste that. We are looking at this passage of gospel-driven life, where we spoke last week about what was it that was driving the Apostle Paul. Like everyone, we all have certain desires that drive us, that we wake up, that there are certain things that drive us to do what we want to do. And we saw how, for Paul, what was driving him was the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he was able and willing to become all things for all people, so that he said, by all means, he might win some. And today we are continuing along in this next chapter. As you read, it begins with the word for, which means it's continuing the conversation that happened in the previous chapter. And we saw what was the challenge, why Paul was writing this to the people in Corinth, was because they all know the gospel. They have experienced the good news of the gospel. But the problem was, because they felt they are free now, they can do whatever they want. And though they know there are certain things they should not do, and it's not good for the health, just like this businessman, that it's not good for the physical body, they knew certain things are not good for their spiritual walk, yet they felt free to go and try and indulge in their desires, and that was hurting them. Because they tended to be driven more by their desires than by the gospel. And here Paul is talking to them, and he's giving them an example from their own history, looking at it from the Old Testament. He's giving them some commands, and then he's leaving them with a promise in this passage to highlight the futility of living lives being driven purely by our own pleasures of what is it that we want. And it's not just our pleasures that are driving us. When you live in the world, there is always things around us that pull us, that constantly tell us, oh, maybe your life is not enough, or maybe you're not enough. Maybe if you just have this thing, your life will be better. And when we are living in the world of social media and Instagram and TikTok, and when you keep scrolling through it, what gets you addicting is that one thing that you feel that you're drawn to, that someone projects that they have and you feel you don't have, and all those things start influencing you and impacting you. And they come in the form of temptations. And sometimes we just cave in. So you're here, Paul is giving this analogy of Christians being on two sides, you have the gospel and you have the world, and it's like a spring that's connecting us. And if the tension between the gospel and us is loose, you're automatically going to be driven and pulled by what you're going to see around you. So there are only two options for us as Christians. We are either going to be driven by the gospel, or we are going to be driven by what we see in the world that pulls us, because the world always promises something better than the gospel all the time. So it's a pull between living a gospel-driven life versus a pleasure-driven life. And this is not something that is new. It's not just happening to the Corinthians now, or it's not just happening to you and me in Silicon Valley now. It started in the Garden of Eden. That was the very first bait that Adam and Eve had to go through. You know, if you read in Genesis, it says when they saw the fruit that God told them not to eat of it, they desired, it looked pleasing to the eye, and they went for it. And it's the same thing that we all experience today as well. We live our lives, we look around when we go to work or go to school or just step out of our homes, and we feel everybody else is having a better life than me, or everybody else looks better than me, or everybody else does better than me, and we tend to let those things affect us. So here Paul is reminding them, first of all, from an example that he gives them from their own history in the first 4 verses, and then moves on to give them some commands in the next 5 verses, and finally leaves them with an encouraging promise. And what he begins with is to say, you guys think you're free and so you can live your lives whatever you want and try to do these things, but don't realize that you can slip and fall. I want to show you, he shared last week how though he had so many privileges, he was not using his freedom to live however he wanted. He was not letting himself just blindly follow his passions to do whatever he wanted, but he was disciplining himself and beating his body so he can win the prize. And I want to come back to that a little bit at the end. So the key words to look at in the first few verses 1 to 5, where he says, if you have your Bibles, turn with me and read it. It says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown into the wilderness." There are 2 phrases that are repeated in the first and second part of this passage. In fact, one word, and if you can find what that word is, that is the key to unlocking it. Do you know what that word is as you look at it? Anyone who is good in solving puzzles or finding, what is that? Spiritual, yeah, that's a word that repeats. But there's one word that repeats even. Yeah, all. Brian got it. There's a word that says all. It's repeated like 6 or 7 times in this first passage. And you can read the verses that follow it. It talks about the words that repeat are some of them, some of them, some of them several times. So he's giving a universal example here from their whole own history of saying, look at your own history. You think you're set free by the gospel so you can just live however you want and follow your passions and let yourself be influenced by your friends or your peers or whatever the world throws at you. Look at your forefathers, Israel. And he talks about the most dramatic thing that happened in the life of Israel. For 400 years, they were really in slavery. They were real slaves. And now God is setting them free. So he takes them to that moment in history where he shows to them, He says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. He's using a covenantal language here, by calling them brothers and referring to what happened to them under the cloud and through the sea, to what our fathers experienced. So he says, in our own history, we have this situation where our own forefathers were slaves. They were slaves in Egypt, but see what God did. God did some dramatic things to rescue them, and they came out of it. And it's a great example of being freed from literal slavery, and he wants them to connect that with their personal spiritual experience. So he says, first thing is how they were under the cloud. And if you know the Exodus story, how when they were freed after all the plagues and they were going towards the Red Sea, the entire Egyptian army was chasing them, and God sends a cloud to come over, creates a chaos so they can actually go through the Red Sea. If someone had a great gospel experience story, it was the Israelites. But he's telling them that's just not enough to protect them. And if you're going to keep thinking, oh, I was saved, I had this one moment in my own life when I was 5 years old or 10 years old or 20 years old, when I had that experience of being freed or saved, and so that's all that I have to share about my spiritual life, but how I live my life today doesn't have any spiritual significance. That's a problem. If the greatest spiritual moment or experience of your life that you have to show is only in the past, and now your life is being lived by just indulging in your pleasures, but where your life is not very different from anybody else outside, that's a problem, which means you're not growing in your gospel understanding. You're not leading a gospel-driven life. So, second thing he says, they passed through the sea. Wow, imagine that. Never happened again in history where an entire nation walked under the Red Sea with walls of water surrounding, such a great supernatural miracle. They experienced a great spiritual high. Maybe you have had spiritual highs in your own walk with God after you had a gospel moment, that you can look back and say, yeah, I had that wonderful time, maybe at a retreat, and or a Sunday school retreat, or a youth retreat, or a church retreat. You can look back to that. But that was just a one-time high, but doesn't have any reflection of how your day-to-day life really is. And then he talks about how he says, I was baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Now, we can speak a lot about it in several different perspectives. Again, it's the covenantal language here. Moses is being a mediator of the old covenant, and how, he's telling the Corinthians, you have a better mediator, Christ, you're in this new covenant, but still, he's saying God gave you great spiritual mentors in your spiritual life, maybe. You had people who came alongside in the past, and they walked with you, and they helped you grow. But how are you now? How is your life now? Does it have any effect, or is there a disconnect? And it says they ate the same spiritual food. It's manna, this heavenly food. Wow, nobody on earth has gotten to taste that before or after. It's a special nourishing. And maybe in your first few years, you had the desire, you were craving for rich spiritual food, you were reading God's word and praying. But if you're only thinking that was the highs and the best moments of my life, and your life now is very disconnected because you've just let your other pleasures take over, that's a problem. It says they even drank the same spiritual drink. And Paul talks about it was Christ who was spiritually nourishing them, not just their physical need of food and water, but Christ as the living water. And above all, it says they experienced the presence of Christ himself. Wow, this is the heights of it. So he's building it up step by step, showing to them how, look at that, first there was the cloud, and then there was this being supernaturally delivered by walking across the Red Sea. And then there was God giving you manna and spiritual food, and even Moses to mediate for you, because every time they fell, unless Moses mediated, he would have wiped them out. And above all, he says, you had the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, which means you were actually in God's presence, like physically. But you know what happened to them, he says, was not enough for them somehow. Somehow, though they had all these great spiritual highs and spiritual experiences, there was something that happened to them because they wanted something more. Why is it? What more can you and I want than being in God's presence, which is supposed to fill us with joy? The problem that even God's very own presence and provision and all was not enough was because they were not able to look back to see what God had done, nor were they able to look up to see where God is, literally like this pillar of cloud and fire, but they were looking out all around them at the other nations and saying it's like when you take your children to a toy store and you get them the first toy, and then they are like, no, I want that toy. You know, they walk out of the store and there is another kid who walks with a bigger toy. They're like, no, I think I want that. That's what's happening. And God was having to tell them, is this not enough? Do you need to be entertained more? You want more? And they said, yes, we want more. Your presence is not enough. It's not fulfilling my desire. And what was the problem? It says God was not pleased with them. And it says in the second passage, thankfully it doesn't say all. God did this to everyone, but some of them fell. They did not take their calling seriously. That they were set free for a purpose. They were set free to live lives that people around them can see them, and through what God did through them, may be able to experience God. Instead of that happening, they started becoming like those outside. So he tells them what are some things that they did and what the Corinthians should not do. The first thing he talks about, if we read in those passages, is he tells them, as a summary statement, verse 6, now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. The problem is desire. So first thing he says is, do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. You know, you read this story in the book of Exodus. Some of those who are doing the power reading will be able to see this even more vividly. What was the main reason for it that they let their other passions come? The first was they had a lot of idols. You know, when Moses goes up to receive the 10 Commandments, they just can't wait. You know, they become restless and their craving for having a literal idol morphs into really getting rid of this God who has redeemed them and freed them to create a golden calf, something that looks like the idol of the world, and they want to attribute to that golden calf, oh, you are the one who saved me from the past. And that's what you and I do, isn't it? You know, what is an idol? We don't make golden calves anymore. But we do create things in our life which becomes an idol, which means what it is it could be anything to which we say, oh, you are the one I am going to trust my life with, because you are going to give me pleasure. You are going to help me be free. You are going to help me feel safe. You're going to help me feel loved. It is not enough when I know that God loves me. No, I need to have this relationship through which is when I will know I am loved. It is not enough for me to feel that I am living God's purpose and I have to live for God and do what He wants. Where sometimes when I think I'm going to get my real pleasure through my children and their success and their failures, and then we go after them to make sure that they become really successful, because that's what the world says. Oh, if you're only successful, you are fine. And we take that bait, and when we do that, that becomes an idol worship. We idolize our children. Or it is our work. Oh, I don't think God can provide for my daily needs. I need this job. And if I lose this, I don't know what's going to happen with my life. So I'm going to be a slave to my work and do whatever it takes and whatever is thrown at me. I'm not going to even think what God wants and how God is my real boss. He's not my boss. And I'm going to fear my worldly boss than I feel my heavenly boss. And I'm going to be willing to sacrifice the time I need to spend with my family and my children and in serving others. Rather than that, I'm going to spend time in slavery to this place and this position. Means that's your idol. Because that's what you're telling God is, no, God, I don't believe you're actually going to provide and take care of me. I have to make sure I don't mess up this boss, this golden calf, because if I don't, tomorrow my life will be crazy. He says, don't go after those idols. What are your idols? I don't know what they are. And then you may even think, oh, my children are my idol. And you know what happens if you do that? God sometimes does things in our children's lives that will get our attention back to Him, to see, who were you worshiping all these years really? Were you worshiping me, or were you worshiping your children? And let me get your attention. And at least now stop it and worship me. Because your children, they're not your children, they're my children. You think you care about your kids? I actually care way more than you do about your kids. You think you have the power to make their life great? No, zero. I have the power to be with them, and I will walk with them, and I will fulfill my covenantal love and plan and purposes for their lives. That can be very freeing. You're not stressed. You don't make your children's life stressful. And rather you can see that they love God and you love God. Second, it says, don't indulge in the pleasures of your heart. They didn't know boundaries. They didn't know what God has ordained to be experienced only in the context of marriage. They wanted to experience those pleasures outside of marriage. And they thought they're fine. Yeah, anyways, I was saved 20 years ago. I've had those great moments. I'm going to make it to heaven anyways, so I can do what I want. Or with food. That's what is the problem here he's talking about. They were willing to eat food that was explicitly sacrificed to idols, and the challenge was it wasn't a neutral thing. We don't understand why it's important, because what happens is these are pagan temples where it's not just food that is being offered, that is sacrificed to idols. There's all kinds of immorality going on there. So people go there, don't just go for the food. They go for all of those things because they want their pleasures fulfilled. And these are all internal things that were happening, and it comes out in external behaviors. And that's what gets God upset. It says they started testing God in the wilderness, that He sent a plague of serpents to go after them. And in every case, you see, thousands of them were just wiped out like that. Because that's something God's very jealous about. And they started grumbling against his servants because they were reminding them about God's covenant and his faithfulness and the need to live holy lives. And they couldn't. So let's read that again. He says, now these things took place as examples for us that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did. And 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. And we know some of them were lost, but there was always God's grace available. And those who depended on grace, those who believed in him, God took them to the promised land. There was Moses and Joshua and Caleb. An entire generation was lost, but he took their children to the promised land. So what is then his command? He says, do not go after the idols. Do not go for your sensual pleasures. Do not test God. Do not start grumbling, because that really goes against God's desire. And he says, do not, if any of you think you are standing firm, be careful, is what he says is the last command. Verse 12, therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed, lest he fall. So his question is asking them to evaluate, where are you spiritually? Don't be counting on your past highs and your stories. Oh, I had this, I did that. Where are you in your spiritual walk right now? Are you craving in to your pleasures and the idols of your heart? And if something doesn't go as planned in your life, are you grumbling against God? Are you grumbling against his leaders or his church when they tell you the truth of God's word? Is your heart getting irritated and upset and fatigued? He says, God is not someone who appreciates that, and he's going to respond in a big way, and you do not have to do that. So take heed. It's a warning for all of us. We are doing this as a year of spiritual revival. There are times when we can take a pause and ask ourselves all these questions. God, how can I grow in my personal walk? Show me the idols of my heart. Show me the desires of my heart. And forgive me for my grumbling and bitterness and anger towards you. And I don't want to live arrogant life thinking I'm anyways going to make it, Lord. Help me not to take the bait. This is how the world lives around me. The temptations and the desires that I'm trying to buy in and letting them define and influence me. Help me not to fall into those temptations in all these areas of my life. And he says the promise at the end, verse 13. There's the same word that's used for trials as well as temptations. It says, no trial or temptation, we can say, has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond our ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. That's a wonderful promise he gives us. The key to overcoming temptations, he says, is God gives a way out of it. First of all, he's not going to give you a temptation or a trial that is more than what you can bear. That's too much for you. But he's going to give a way out of that temptation. He gives a little clue to that in the end of the last passage we read last week. He talks about this image of this athlete, how everybody trains so hard and disciplines themselves, and only one wins. So he uses the word self-control and self-discipline. The word self-control in Greek, it's ego kratia. Ego means self, from which comes the word ego. Kratia means command. It's one of the fruit of the Spirit. And this self-control is not something you can manufacture by your own self. It's something that comes as you live your life in union with God. You see that even with Jesus, when he was tempted in the wilderness, because he had that constant union with his Father, he was able to overcome all these temptations that Satan was throwing at him when he was at his weakest and most vulnerable. So what is this fruit of the Spirit of self-control? I mean, that's where he lands as the solution. You know, the word self-control means you're in self-command. It's a synonym for being free. Because if you're not self-control, then guess what you are? You are out of control. You know, there's that desire you're not able to control. It just takes you over. And if you're out of control, it means that you're slave to some other forces and you're not free. There is that one thing that's, it can be different things for different people. You know, for some of you men, it can be these things that you see with your eyes, what you ought not to see, and you're not able to free yourself from that. You just give in. So to be free and to be self-controlled in one sense is the same thing. And that's why he uses the imagery of the athlete preparing to compete in a game. You know, in the book of Hebrews, it says life is like a race. But the book of Hebrews gives us a secret of how you can run in such a way that you're not disqualified. Hebrews chapter 12, it says, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked for us. And how does it ask us to do? It says, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. It says, if you want to run well, the book of Hebrews says, look to Jesus because he ran well. He was the only athlete who crossed the finish line and won the prize. He left heaven and came to earth and became a human being. He ran the race of being a human being. He ran all the way to the cross. He endured. He never gave up. Even though not only did he feel like his heart was breaking apart when they speared him, he still ran for the prize. What was the prize that Jesus won in running? It says it was the joy set before him. What was the joy? Is this joy Jesus never had before? He already had joy in the presence of his Father. But the joy that Jesus came to have on earth to win, what was it that he didn't already have in heaven? You know what he came to win was you and me. That was his price. That gives him joy for which he did. And in the previous chapter, Paul talked about how when an athlete wins, he gets this wreath, which is just a wreath made of leaves that eventually fades away. But he says, when you run the race well, and you're exercising the fruit of the Spirit of self-control, it says you'll receive an imperishable wreath. But for you and I to receive that crown, that imperishable crown, Jesus had to wear the crown of thorns. For you and I are actually the real crown of Jesus. But for us to be his crown, he had to endure the crown of the thorn on the cross. We are his most precious thing. We are the glory that Jesus takes to God the Father. And he was able to win it. Jesus Christ loved God with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength, and he loved his neighbor as himself like none of us ever could or will. He never caved into all these desires that even Satan threw at him. And since none of us are able to do that, we're all disqualified. We don't finish the race. He was the only one who finished it. And we shouldn't get the crown, isn't it? But because when he ran the race perfectly and he got to the end of his life, he got the crown. He got the wreath on his head too. Because he took the crown of thorns you and I deserve for the way in which we ran, so that we may have the gift of life. We were disqualified, but he took the crown of thorns so that when we believe in him, we get the crown of life that his running of the race earned. And that ought to motivate us to be able to exercise the gift of self-control, to be able to say no to the things of the world. And how do we practically do it? How will it happen in a practical way? Well, we just turned to the model of Jesus himself. What did he do to be able to say no to these worldly desires? One was he was living in this union life every day of his life. He was led by the Spirit every moment and every day of his life, which involved him being in God's Word. And we all know, we repeat this several times because we forget, the first best weapon we have to be able to say no to the things of the desires of the world is something very simple and yet very hard, isn't it? Isn't that why we are not able to do it? Being in God's Word. Because God's Word was what he used to fight even what Satan threw at him. Because Satan used God's Word. It is when he went to him and said, "It is written," and what did Jesus say? It is also written. That's our defense. And he has given us his precious word, and yet how many of us struggle to read it? Not in a legalistic way, because it's like someone wakes up, a blind man, and goes out to the streets to live his day without taking his stick that he needs to follow. And then we fail and fall and we give in to the desires and we don't know why. And that's why you need this constant reset, every day being in God's Word. But he also has another way for us to be able to experience this growth in self-control, and that's through trials. And he allows those trials, like he did for the Israelites, but not with a way to punish and destroy us, but for a way to draw us back. So you have to examine your lives today and ask yourself, what am I missing? Maybe you are going through a trial right now in your life related to your job or your children or your career choice or relationships. And maybe you're just upset using that with God instead of using that to see, maybe God is allowing this in my life right now to reorient my desires. And ask myself, am I being driven by my desires and the world, or is it driven by this love of Jesus who took this crown of thorns so that I can have this crown of life? Let's pray.